The Book of Life by H. W. Hodgetts, William, from LoveTheMeaningOfLife.com. Spiritual Evolution, Love the Meaning of Life, an Oasis for Spiritual Searchers. Paradise Lost. There was a time in the world when life was much simpler, everything that the self needed was freely available, and the skill required to get those things was easily learned and passed on. In those days life was lived to its fullness, and the only things to worry about was survival and the pursuit of pleasure. Life was not complicated then. It was a time when people were hunter-gatherers in a free and natural world. They were the days when people had more free time to contemplate the nature of reality, and even the nature of life itself. In those simpler times, curiosity was free to search for understanding, for knowledge of the self. Do you feel it? That urge to get back to nature, to escape the world you now find yourself in, a world that is so complicated and full of conflict, a world in which there is no peace of mind, no freedom from the oppression to conform to the will of others, who neither care about your feelings nor recognize the real you inside. Do you feel it? That constant struggle to be known, accepted and loved, and the fear of being criticized and rejected for not conforming to the wishes of those who only want to use you to fulfill their own desires. Have you been made to feel that you have little or no worth? Have you been made to feel that your life journey in the struggle for peace and pleasure is futile, as if you were on a treadmill going nowhere? Have you stopped and said to yourself, there must be more to life than this? There is, and I found it. Now my life has become a more beautiful experience than I could ever have imagined, and it is my mission to show you the way, so that you too can find your way back to the paradise you lost. If you are a genuine seeker of love, truth and understanding, it is because you have experienced the feeling that you are different to other people, and you have felt that this world is not the place that you belong to. Those feelings are not wrong, you are different, and this world is not the place that you came from, or will end up in. You have awakened to the reality of your own existence as a single and unique entity, separate from all that existed outside of it, as if in the center of infinity. In those moments there was no understanding of what and where you were. The only thing that you knew for certain was that you exist, but that feeling of I am triggered the self's curiosity, and you found yourself asking the most important questions that you will ever ask. Without those answers, of what worth is any other knowledge, of what worth is any life journey? Here you will find those answers, and you will know just how precious, powerful, and loved that you are. I know what you have suffered and endured, because I have too. I know you have made mistakes as I have, but you will be returned to innocence and all things will be made new. I see the real you inside, and I feel what you feel, because we are the same. I am not one to judge you because I understand, and my love is unconditional. I know what you search for, and all I can do is guide you, not as a master but as a servant. It is time to write a new page in the book of your life. That which is past is gone and cannot be changed. It is the rest of your life journey that matters. This is a new beginning, a new path to what was always your destiny. You are not alone, and you are loved. The self's image, it is the way that the most obvious thing is the most difficult to perceive, and the most difficult thing to perceive is the self's true image. It can also be said that familiarity breeds contempt. We become so familiar with our existence that we do not recognize it, and so we ignore it to the extent that when we use the word I to refer to the self, it either becomes an empty word that is given no consideration, or the self mistakenly thinks that when using the word I, they are referring to the physical body as the self. There is the self that is referred to as I, which is immortal. There is also the self's alter ego, which is defined as the other I. It is the self's alter ego that is referred to as the self's soul. It is the self's soul that determines the nature of the life journey that we experience. It is through the soul that we interact with the mind. It is through the mind that we interact with the physical body, and it is through the physical body that we interact with the world. There is where the self, that which you refer to as I, actually is, and there is the place where you feel that you are. So the question is, where do you feel that you are right now? It is a question seldom considered. Ask yourself, where am I? Take a look around you through your physical eyes and try to determine where you are in relation to what you see. Where does it feel like you are? Does it feel like you are just in front of your physical eyes, that you are in and a part of the world that you see? Think about that for a moment, and realize that what you are experiencing is an illusion. When you drift off into deep thought, even though your physical eyes are open, also known as daydreaming, where does it then feel like you are? When you fall asleep and dream, where does it feel like you are? When you are awake and in deep thought, or asleep and dreaming, where are you? Where is that which you refer to as I? And if you are seeing things, how and with what are you able to see those things if not through your physical eyes? The self cannot exist in front of that which it is looking through, and so the self must exist somewhere behind what it is seeing with. There is where you are, and there is the illusion of where you feel that you are. Focus of attention. The illusion and therefore feeling of being somewhere that you are not is the result of where the self focuses its attention. It is what you focus your attention on that determines what you feel, and therefore the kind of life that you are experiencing. The more focused your attention is, the more intense your feelings become. This is because there is feedback, which is like an echo. Everything that the self focuses its attention on has an effect on what the self feels, and those feelings can be either pleasurable, painful, or peaceful. Whenever the self focuses its attention on something, it is actually creating an attachment to it, one that can only be broken by focusing the self's attention on something different. All attachments are created and sustained in response to the self's desire. Awareness is feeling. Desire is also a feeling. It is a feeling that is different to the self's natural feelings of peaceful existence. Feelings of desire, which are feelings of wanting or needing, began when the self first experienced the feeling of pleasure and then wanted more. Desire and peace cannot coexist. Desire takes away peace. When a desire is fulfilled, it results in pleasure, therefore a state of desire is a state of suffering until it is fulfilled. Even when a desire is fulfilled and pleasure is then experienced, that pleasure is not sustainable, and so another desire for pleasure arises. The question now is there a way to silence desire and achieve sustainable unending pleasure? There is, and we will look at the things preventing you from finding it. A new page. Every life journey is like a book in which everything that the self does and experiences is recorded. The title of the book is The Life of I. Everyone's journey is different, and so every book is unique and personal. It is only the self that is capable of writing in the book of its life journey, and what is written in secret, and only the self knows what it has written. Everything that is written according to what the self understands and believes to be true at the time of writing, because the self cannot lie to the self. The book is of course the self's subconscious mind, and its entries are memories of what it has come to know and experience. When the self looks back in its book of life, it can see what was, and nothing of that can be rewritten. When the self looks at the present entry, it can see what is and how far it has progressed. The following pages are blank and yet to be written on. These pages will determine what is to come. It is not the past that matters, but rather where the self is now and where it is going. Change can only begin to happen at the beginning of the present page in the book of the self's life journey. It is the self's image which is, and what was, and what is to come that is the most important thing. The time for healing. There are times that look back over my life journey and I wonder, how the hell did I survive? I had spent so many years in survival mode, hiding my true feeling from others, pretending to be what I was not, and all in the hope of being accepted and loved, but love can be a terrible burden when it is one way and not returned. I would always be trying to please others, putting their needs before my own. It was because of this that others saw me as easily led, and someone to be taken advantage of. The strange thing is that I knew when I was being lied to. I could see what they were up to, but it made no difference. I was afraid of confrontation, criticism, and rejection. What made things worse was that I was very sensitive and emphatic. I lay awake so many nights questioning my existence and the reason for it. I had no one to share my thought and feelings with. I was afraid they would react as if I was a nut job. I even considered that myself at times. I knew that I was different from others, and I asked myself, why can't I be like them? Was love, empathy, and being sensitive a form of mental illness, one that prevented me from being successful in the game of life that everyone seemed to be playing? Life was so confusing. To say that I have suffered depression and anxiety is an understatement. I have walked only path through the deepest, darkest places, and I have known the fear of an empty and futile life without meaning. I have felt the sting of criticism to the point that I felt worthless and undeserving of love, of being an utter failure, with no other purpose in life than to suffer for the pleasure of others. It was a life that at times became so unbearable that I wanted to end it, but I failed even at that. This world can be a terrible and lonely place for loving souls, but only because they are deprived of love, truth, and understanding. I found these treasures, and you have found me. All that I have will be yours. I am changed and you will be too. Things are different now. My life has become a beautiful experience, and I am filled with happiness and contentment. I am free from suffering, fear, and ignorance. I alone am the master of my own life and destiny. I have found truth, understanding, wisdom, and the love that I had always searched for. The book of my life has become the story of one who found the greatest prize of all, a blissful life. It is not where you have been or what you have done that matters, it is where you are now and what you do in the future that will determine your destiny. If you knew then what you are about to learn, you would not have made any mistakes, or suffered in the way that you have. Forgive yourself and let's move on. Nothing that is in the past can be changed, only the future is in your hands. So walk with me for a while and share what I have found, and you too can have a blissful life. The time for healing has come. Guilt. It is with the self's book of its life journey that the self can review the knowledge that it has gained, and how much it has understood concerning that knowledge. Life is a journey of learning, and when learning it is inevitable that mistakes are made, mistakes that leave the self clinging to feelings of guilt and not worthy of love, as it is if somehow their image is forever stained. Feelings of guilt can cripple the self on its life journey, and leave the self open to being manipulated and used. Guilt creates fear and self-loathing, but it can only flourish and be sustained by a lack of understanding. It is said that those who forgive others for what they have done to the self, will themselves be forgiven. It is a truth that true forgiveness can only come through understanding. It is also a truth that forgiveness negates karma. Guilt is not a curse, it is a blessing. It is a feeling and understanding that the self has done what is wrong. To feel guilt, the self must first know what is good and right. It is guilt that makes the self question what it has done wrong and search for understanding. It is guilt that helps the self learn from its mistakes. Feeling guilt is proof that the self has a conscience. In other words, the self has a moral sense of what is right and wrong. The conscience is the voice of the higher uncorrupted self, and one must always be true to it. Those who do not feel guilt for doing wrong to others, are like this because they do not understand that they have done wrong. They are devoid of truth and understanding because they are incapable of empathy. They go through life learning nothing of worth. It is those who create chaos and suffering for others. Guilt should be carried no further than necessary, and the point that the guilt should be left behind is when its lesson has been learned and understood. If the self knew and understood then what it knows and understands now, then what it did to cause guilt would not have happened. The feeling of guilt is payment and repentance in itself. To continue feeling guilt after its lesson has been learned, is no more than the infliction of unjustified self-harm. It is in the suffering and learning that forgiveness is earned and the debt is paid for. Forgive yourself as you have forgiven others. Love yourself as you have loved others. There is no point in the self being forgiven by others if the self does not accept that forgiveness, and there is no point in the self forgiving itself if it has not learned its lesson. Those who do not forgive carry the burden of hate, which is an unfulfilled desire to cause harm, either to the self or others. Forgive everyone for every hurt that they caused you. It is the loving thing to do, and it will bring peace and make your journey lighter. Empathy. To empathize with another is something that we choose to do. It occurs when we focus our attention on the feelings and thoughts of someone else. We then imagine in our own mind what they are thinking and feeling, and by doing this we too experience the effects of what the other one is experiencing. It is like we become them. Empathy is something that we learn to do, and the more we practice it, the more sensitive we become. We empathize with others because we care about them. If we don't care, then we don't consider their feelings. If someone says they love you but is incapable of empathy, then their words are carnal and empty. They love the body and not the one who animates it. When we empathize with another sentient being, either human or animal, the feeling that we experience can be either pleasurable or hurtful. We can feel their joy or suffering. When they are happy, we are happy. When they are hurting, we feel that hurt. The more sensitive you are, the more intense are the feelings. This is the source of our compassion and love. For those who have become very sensitive, empathy can seem like a blessing or a curse, and when they experience the suffering of another that they can do nothing to alleviate, they are left with no choice but to look away, because the suffering becomes too much to bear. However, such empaths are capable of experiencing the greatest love that can be shared. So why do we need empathy, and how do we control it? Empathy can be the greatest source of pleasure or the greatest source of suffering, and yet without it mankind would be ruled over completely by their basic, primitive, primeval instincts. Without empathy, mankind would be less caring than animals, and much more dangerous because of their intelligence. I want you to imagine for a moment what this world would be like without the ability to empathize. It is only those who have chosen to empathize that have held back and resisted a force of evil and suffering that is so great it is almost beyond comprehension. We see that evil and suffering raising its head in the world even today, caused by those who choose to deny and bury their empathy. They see it as an obstruction in their pursuit of wealth and power, and they see it as a weakness in others to be taken advantage of. Those without empathy see no value in anyone's life except for their own and those who stand with them, and people wonder why the world is the way it is. Empathy is a doorway to the soul, and it is a bridge between souls, without which love cannot be shared, and compassion cannot be felt. Without empathy, we each stand alone in the darkness of ignorance. I choose to be emphatic, to love unconditionally, to suffer for what is good and right. Because my empathy is tempered with wisdom, and it is not wasted on those who have denied and buried their empathy, in the pursuit of wealth and power, or those I have no possible way of helping. This is the wisdom of empathy, not to suffer if no change is possible to achieve. Why should anyone suffer for the sake of what is not good and right? All we can ever do is be a beacon of light, and take care that we are not dragged into the darkness of the ignorant. I love everyone, even those that do evil, but my priority is to protect those that know what is good and right, those who have not buried and denied their empathy, the awakened. Order out of chaos. The only thing that gives life meaning and makes it worth living is pleasure, and so the driving force behind life is to pursue and experience pleasure. It is the same for the self and for all sentient beings. All that anyone ever wanted was to be happy. The pursuit of carnal pleasure is the self's strongest desire, and desire always takes away peace until it is fulfilled. This is the cause of two main problems that create chaos and conflict. The first is that the self is not the only sentient being pursuing pleasure, which means all sentient beings are competing for the same thing. The second problem is that pleasure can be had from doing what is good or from doing what is evil. There are laws that must be followed if sentient beings are to coexist together in peace and harmony. These laws are the laws of life, without which there is only chaos, conflict and suffering. To act according to the laws of life is to do what is good and right, in other words to act according to love and truth. To change these laws by adulterating them and then acting on what is no longer good and right, is to do what is evil. Wisdom is understanding the difference between what is good and what is evil, and choosing what is good. Wisdom is found in knowing the causes and effects of right and wrong actions. It is not wise to cause others harm or loss when in pursuit of one's own pleasure, because this will not only cause harm to the self's soul, it will also mean you cannot complain when others do the same to you. This is the meaning of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is the basis of justice. Causing hurt or loss to others starts a chain reaction of violence, and the only way to break that chain reaction is to turn the other cheek and not seek revenge which harms the soul. Simply knowing the laws of life is not enough to prevent someone from cheating in the game of life. In fact, if they are not empathic, then knowing the laws of life will only serve to empower them in their own pursuit of self-pleasure. They will seek out those who are empathic and act according to the laws of life, and through the use of weaponized psychology they will use and abuse them, and because they are not themselves empathic, they will feel no guilt for their deceit and violence. Without empathy there is only deception, there is no understanding, no real love except for the self. Without love even truth has no worth. Unconditional love is the greatest pleasure that can be experienced. It is the only thing that can bring order out of chaos. Wealth and power. People are in nature hunter-gatherers, both of worldly things and spiritual things. It is the most natural and primal instinct, driven by the desire for security and pleasure. We all have to learn or be taught the skills of hunting, whether it is for worldly things or spiritual things, and there are many teachers who lead others astray in order to protect what they themselves have, or in order to gain control over those who seek and profit from them. The things that we gather are our possessions, which are referred to as our treasure, and it is our treasure that determines our wealth. Worldly wealth exists outside of the self, where it must be guarded and protected from those who would steal it and even kill for it, and so it becomes a threat to security. In the end it is lost anyway, because what is in and of the world stays in the world, and it leaves no profit for a life journey. There is no wrong in having worldly possessions. What does matter is how they were obtained and what you do with them. There is worldly wealth and there is spiritual wealth, and one alone must be given priority. You cannot serve both equally, because one will be loved and the other loathed, meaning the self will suffer inner conflict. Spiritual treasure is inner treasure, and what is inside stays inside and cannot be taken. It is everlasting, and in the end you do take it with you. It is the treasure of love, truth and understanding. Power is the ability to control what is outside of the self, and this usually means power over others, the ability to control their actions by deception and violence. It is people who lack empathy that engage in such things because they are ignorant of other people's feelings and care only for what they themselves feel. It is said that knowledge is power, and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. The knowledge that is being referred to is psychology, soul science, in other words, knowledge of what controls a person's behavior, their thoughts, emotions and driving forces. Such knowledge is hidden from those who seek spiritual treasure, because if it wasn't, there would be no way to deceive and control them. Knowledge is power and only corrupts those who are ignorant of the spiritual nature, and absolute power only corrupts absolutely those who are dead to the spirit, those who do not know who and what they are. Because of this they also forget what and who you are. All men, souls are born equal, but how easily we forget. How small is the meaning of worldly things to those who have known the pleasure of spiritual treasure. Is the pleasure of even a handful of love, truth and understanding not greater than all the material treasure of the world? We are born into spiritual poverty and may wish to die that way, but not the awakened. It may come as a surprise to many that to possess the ability to empathize means that they have extrasensory perception, i.e. ESP, also known as the sixth sense or the second sight. It is the ability to see in your own mind what is seen in the mind of another, and in seeing also experience personally what they are feeling. The ability to empathize also opens the doorway to the self's other psychic powers, which include intuition, telepathy, psychometry, clairvoyance, clairaudience, precognition and retrocognition etc. I know this because I have experienced such things. They always happen unexpectedly and without effort. I have noticed that if you try to force such things it tends to block them, they must occur naturally. Science has rejected the existence of psychic powers because they cannot be explained by natural laws, i.e. the laws of physics relating to the physical, material universe. However, they have not taken into consideration that the self and mind are not physical, material things that are not constrained by natural laws, but by supernatural laws, or that psychic powers are not a thing of the physical body, but of the soul. Your supernatural powers will reveal themselves only when it is certain that you will not use them for what is not good and right. If you seek such powers they will resist your efforts. If you are emphatic then you have a good heart, you care about others, and I have no doubt that you have made many sacrifices of your own pleasure, and suffered for others. Be strong, don't change for anything, you are order in this chaotic world, and the greatest prize of perfect love is within your reach. I know because we are the same, we are the children of love. Using supernatural powers can be extremely dangerous and cause great fear and harm to the self, when the self does not fully understand them and loses control due to fear, so leave them for now. The journey begins the self and only the self, has in its sole possession the book of its life, and as there is in every book, there is a first page. Before the book was unlocked there existed the one who would open it, the one to whom the book belonged, the only one capable of opening that book and begin making entries. That one was and is, the self that is you. The book was unlocked and opened with the two most powerful words of truth that could ever be spoken, I am. These words came when the self first realized its own existence. It is on the first page of the book of the self's life journey, that the self's first and true image is recorded. The self is an eternal, unchangeable, spiritual entity that has a distinct and independent existence. The self's image is not the self, the two exist separately from each other. The first and true image of the self is a reflection of the unchangeable self. It is this image that must be remembered, so that the self can once again come to know itself. The self's true image is presented on the first page of the book of its life journey, and beneath that image are written the words, I am that I am. It is when the self sees its perfect image reflected from that first page, that it knows itself. It knows who it is and what it is, and that is all that the self knows, because the rest of the pages in the book are blank, and so there is nothing but the self's own image to focus its attention on. The self that we refer to as I cannot be changed in any way, its form always remains the same, i.e. eternal and unbreakable. I always remains I. It is untouched by time and so never ages. The material universe and all that it contains, including the physical body, are all subject to aging and decay, but the self that is referred to as I remains forever young. The first self-realization at the beginning of the self's life journey is what becomes forgotten, and it is what should be remembered. It is when that happens that the end is the same as the beginning. This is why it is said, that you must become as little children. There is the self and there is what the self feels. The self cannot change but what the self feels can and does. Awareness is feeling and all feelings are caused by the vibrational effect of what the self focuses its attention on that is outside of the self. The greater the self's focus of attention becomes the more the self is affected, in other words, the more the self focuses its attention on something, the stronger the self's feelings become. Removing focus of attention removes what is felt. In the beginning there was only one page for the self to focus its attention on and the self felt good, but in the pursuit of more pleasure more pages were written in, and these became a distraction, leading to suffering and the forgetting of who and what the self is. It is only on the self's present page that the self experiences consciousness, because that is the page that the self is focusing its attention on. All previous pages are memories, and are referred to as the subconscious. The self can of course look back through its pages by redirecting its focus of attention to them, and when it focuses its attention on one of those memories, it can re-experience what it had felt. When the self experiences dreamless sleep, it simply goes to a blank page and makes no entries. In this state the self simply withdraws its focus of attention and rests. Deep meditation is different to dreamless sleep, because in meditation the self has something to focus its attention on fully, and without distractions. When a state of deep meditation is reached, the self is not affected by any information from the five physical senses, and so for the duration of the deep meditation it is as if the physical, material realm does not exist. Deep meditation requires the self's full focus of attention, and while the self is engaged in this it remains fully conscious. Deep meditation can serve two purposes. The first is a search for understanding, and the second is to attain a state of peace. Neither of these will get the self back to the first page in the book of life, because they are both distractions that will hold the self's attention on its present and latest page of the book of its life journey. The invisible barrier: when the self tries to come to know itself, it finds its path blocked by some invisible and powerful force that it cannot comprehend. It doesn't matter how hard the self pushes or how strong its willpower is, it will not be able to break through the barrier that is blocking it. In fact, the harder the self pushes, the more resistant the barrier becomes. For those who strive to come to know themselves, in an effort to free themselves from the bondage and suffering of the world, and to find the way back to their true home, which is in the beginning, this is the place where they, sooner or later, give in, and end what seems to be an impossible task. But there is a way back to the self's first page. I know this because I found it. Listen and understand: the purpose of a life journey is to pursue and experience pleasure and to overcome anything that gets in the way of this. The self's mission is to seek out new knowledge that will enable the self to discover new ways to experience pleasure. Pleasure can be experienced from knowledge of both good and knowledge of evil. It is part of the self's mission to gain the wisdom to choose correctly. Wisdom leads to transcendence, and a lack of wisdom leads to reincarnation, and another new life journey. Transcendence leads to a single, eternal life journey, one that is filled with pleasure and absent of any suffering. Without wisdom the self cannot free itself from suffering or continuing life journeys in the world. The wheel of life: the self's desire for pleasure is the driving force that turns the wheel of life. One full revolution of the wheel of life is equal to one full life journey. The wheel of life stops in the very same place where it began turning. In other words, the end of a life journey is the same as its beginning. When desire ceases, the wheel of life stops turning, even if the life journey is not complete. This is the point where the self experiences transcendence from the wheel of life, and rises instantly to the place of enlightenment. In other words, the self is transported directly to its first page, where it regains its innocence and knowledge of itself. The self first feels a profound sense of peace as it finds itself in the light of understanding. Then comes the full realization of the self's existence and the nature of what the self is. Following this, the self feels its whole being filling up and being completely permeated with the pleasure of righteous love, which is warm, unconditional, perfect and eternal. Everything feels so calm and natural there. It is a place where fear and want do not exist, a place where the self realizes its true power and immortality. The self is unable to stay there because it still has a life journey to complete, and so the self returns to finish that life journey and to help others to find their way home. When the self returns to the wheel of life, it reinstates its perfect alter ego, and it is the self's righteous desire that turns the wheel, as the self resumes its journey. This time the self is fearless and pursues its pleasure only through unconditional love, and sharing truth and understanding with those who are ready to listen and understand. You will live forever because you are an immortal spiritual being, and your suffering will end when you alone realize that you are the master of your life and your destiny. The invisible and powerful force that blocks the path when the self attempts to come to know itself, is the self's own desire. It is the very force that turns the wheel of life. When an irresistible force meets an immovable object, the result is eternal conflict. Imagine the wheel of life being obstructed by the wall of a very high mountain. To try and continue along the same path would be impossible, and so the only alternatives to end eternal conflict are, to let go of the self's desire to come to know itself, and take a path around the mountain, and then continue on its life journey, searching for other ways to fulfill its desire for pleasure, which would allow the self to reach the end of its life journey and reincarnate in a new life journey. For the self to cease any and all desire and remain where it is, not caring about the past, the present or the future. In this state the self realizes that life is a game that it doesn't want to play anymore. It sees the futility of struggling for temporary pleasures in a finite life journey, and it realizes that the only things that are of any worth are love and truth. The self has now reached the point where it stands alone with nothing that the world can take from it, and with only love in its heart. Sometimes you have to give in to win. The greatest reward requires the greatest sacrifice. The key to transcendence and the way home is perfect inner peace, which can only be experienced in the complete absence of desire. To achieve this state of no desire, the self must end its pursuit of pleasure, the giving in must be complete. Only then will the self be released from the rim of the wheel of life and transcend up to its center and return to its true self. The alter ego must become one with the ego. Spaces. There is a difference between where the self believes that it is and where the self actually is. So the question for the self is, where am I? Is my focus of attention on the space that I occupy, or am I experiencing an illusion of being somewhere that I am not? When the self dreams, it experiences the illusion that it is in the place that it is dreaming about. We can call this the dream space. When the self is in an awakened state, it can intentionally enter deep thought and experience daydreaming, remembrance and meditation. We can call this the contemplation space. When the self withdraws from the dream space and the contemplation space, it finds itself in this world, experiencing life through a physical body. We can call this the world space. When the self is not in any of these spaces, there is only the unconscious, dreamless state left to enter, where the self doesn't experience anything. We can call this the dead space. The only space left to consider is the space in which the self actually exists as an entity. We can call this the I space. We now have 5 spaces, which are dream space, contemplation space, world space, dead space and the I space. Spaces are places, and the I space is the first and most important space that contains only the self as an aware spiritual entity. All of the spaces have one thing in common: to experience any of these spaces requires the self's focus of attention, and the self's attention can only focus on one thing at a time. Focus of attention. When the self's focus of attention is on a space outside of itself, then it cannot focus on the I space in which the self exists. What the self experiences depends on what it is focusing its attention on. The more focused the self's attention is, the greater the effect will be from what its attention is on. It is the self's focus of attention and where it is directed that creates the illusion that the self is somewhere that it is not. The self never moves from the I space that it exists in and fills. The self is where it has always been, and that is not in the physical body or any other space that is outside of the I space. The self's focus of attention is always where the self desires it to be. The greater the self's desire is, the stronger its focus of attention becomes. Whenever the self tries to discern where it is, it should come to a realization when it considers all the things that are not the self and say, I am here, that is there, and this is my space, that is the space, and I am that I am, that is what it is. Remember that it is the self's focus of attention that creates the illusion that it is somewhere that it is not. The stronger the self's desire becomes, the more focused its attention is, and the more focused the attention is, the more the self is affected. For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The self creates what it feels, pleasant or unpleasant, and the self can either sustain those feelings by continued focus of attention, or it can either let go of its desire, or focus its attention on something else. The self can only focus its attention fully on one thing at a time, and it is the self that chooses what to focus its attention on. When the self finds that its attention is difficult to remove from something that is causing it hurt, the self must realize that it is feeding what is causing the hurt, and instead of feeding it, the self should simply watch what is causing the hurt. The desire is then changed from feeding to watching. It is the self that controls the mind, and it is the mind that controls the body. All things within the mind are created according to the self's desire. If a desire cannot be fulfilled and is causing too much hurt, then let it go. Without desire, the self would do nothing. In other words, every action that the self takes is preceded by the desire to act. This means that the self's focus of attention goes where the self wants it to go. When the self focuses its attention on something, what it is doing is creating an attachment to it, and the only way to break that attachment is to either focus your attention on something else or let go of the desire. Desire is the cause of both the self's pleasure and its suffering. It is not wise to focus your attention on, and remain attached to something that is causing you to suffer, because that suffering will gradually take all of your attention, leaving no space in your mind to focus on a solution to the problem. It is then that you find yourself trapped in a state of anxiety. It is like holding a burning piece of coal in your hand, not wanting to let go of it. The wise thing is to drop it until your mind becomes clear enough to work out a way to handle it. If you can't find a way, then leave it where it is. Sometimes you have to give in to win. The ego and the alter ego. The Latin definition of the word ego is I, which is a direct reference to the self. It is the self that experiences awareness, including the awareness of its own existence. From the self's standpoint, its impression is that the self exists in the center of infinity. In other words, everything exists outside of the self. The same thing is felt by every spiritual being. From here until forever and all that is between is outside of the self that you refer to as I. The word ego has been wrongly used to describe a characteristic of the self that is somehow vain to possess. It is described as having or showing an excessively high opinion of one's appearance or abilities. The Latin definition of the word vain is empty, without substance. In other words, people have been led to believe that it is wrong to love the self, and that it is selfish and shameful to do so under any circumstances. If you do not love yourself, then you cannot respect yourself, and if you cannot respect yourself, you leave yourself open and accepting of disrespect of you by others, who will then attempt to dominate and control you. If you do not love yourself, then what have you got to give in return for the love given to you by others? If you have to have disrespect for yourself in order for people to accept you, then you should ask yourself, what is the worth of being accepted by such people? The word vain can be used in a positive way or a negative way, but it is mostly used in a negative way. The positive way can only be used to describe someone who has truly come to know the self and is bold, confident, and loving of themselves and others. They are full of love, truth, and understanding. The negative way is used to describe someone that has not come to know themselves or their true worth, and so their vanity is false. It is not in the interests of those who wish to control you that you recognize the self and your true worth. It is not in their interest that you come to know yourself and discover the truth that will set you free, because then they will not be able to control or profit from you with wealth and power. They do not open the path, they make sure that it is blocked. Ego means I. It is a direct reference to the self, the you inside, the real you. The Latin definition of the words alter ego is the other I. The ego is not the alter ego. The alter ego is a projection into the mind of the self's image, desire, and emotions. Some people have multiple alter egos which represent multiple personalities, but they can only present one at a time. There are two ways of visualizing the self and its alter ego. The first is to visualize the self as the puppet master, and the alter ego as the puppet. The second way is to visualize the alter ego as a mask, through which the self perceives and interacts with the world. In this way the real self remains hidden from others. The true self cannot be altered or corrupted in any way, but that which is outside of the self and in the mind can be. Who am I? The self interacts with the rest of reality based on what the self believes itself to be, and what the self believes itself to be, is based on the image that the self has of itself. All images exist in the mind, but that which perceives those images does not. There is the observer and that which is observed. The self's image of itself changes as it progresses on its life journey, but the self cannot change and become something else, therefore the self's true image cannot change. The image that you are experiencing life through now is not your true image, it is an illusion, it is a changeable image. For the self to come to know its true self, it must once more experience life through its first and true image. To do that, the self must come to understand the nature of the illusion and how it has become overwhelmed and trapped in it. The universe within. In the beginning there was the self and its empty virgin mind. When the self first became aware of its existence, its first and true image appeared in its mind. The self then divided its mind into three parts: the superconscious, intimate space, in which the self retained its true image; the conscious, creating space; and the subconscious, storage space. Spaces are places in the mind. The subconscious mind was then altered, creating both the subconscious mind and the emotional mind as separate entities. The lower conscious mind was then separated from the conscious, creating mind. This resulted in the mind being separated into 5 distinctive spaces, minds. To make things easier to understand, we can now take a different view. It is important to remember that the self can only project its attention into one mind at a time, and can only fully focus its attention on one thing that is in that mind. When focus of attention is removed from something in the mind, it disappears from awareness. Focus of attention is required to sustain what is sensed. As above, so below. The self does not need to focus its attention on what it perceives in the conscious mind in order to sustain those things, indeed it would not be possible, and so to overcome this problem the self stores everything that it perceives, all the knowledge that it acquires, in the subconscious mind in the form of memories. This allows the self to focus its attention wherever it desires without distraction. That which is stored in the subconscious mind is not seen, but rather its existence is felt. It is only when a subconscious feeling is focused on that it is brought into the conscious mind once more, where it is formed into images and re-experienced. In the beginning there was only the self and its image in the superconscious, intimate mind. The self's focus of attention then fell on the rest of its mind, where it divided it into 3 separate minds. After further dividing the subconscious mind to accommodate the storage mind and the emotional mind, the self began creating in the conscious mind. The self then recreated an image of itself in the conscious, creation mind, and stored that image in the subconscious, storage mind as a memory. The other I, the self's focus of attention had been removed from the superconscious mind and had been directed to the conscious, creating mind, and so the self's true image had been dissolved, but the self had recreated its true image in the conscious, creation space, and it too dissolved when the self's focus of attention went elsewhere. But not before it had been stored in the subconscious, storage space for later retrieval and remembrance. There is only one true ego and one true alter ego. This is likened to a father and an only son. A true copy and the only copy of the self's true image, had now been stored in the subconscious mind. It was a perfect and uncorrupted image of the self, and the self could no longer see its own image. After further creation and preparation, the self retrieved its image from the subconscious mind, bringing it once more into the lower conscious mind, and the self projected its desire and emotions through this personified image of itself. It was as if the self was the image, but what the self had created from the dust of its memory and the water of its emotions, was its alter ego, its other self. It was through this image that the self would interact with reality and experience life. The sixth space, the self, was not the only spiritual being in existence, and so what the self would have to learn was how to coexist in peace and love with all other spiritual beings, and a place had already been prepared for this, a place that was separate from the spaces which each spiritual being existed in. We know this space as the world space, which exists in the material realm. It is a place outside of the self and mind, a place that we interact with through a physical body, which is another place through which we focus our attention and experience life through. It is the sixth space, and the self is not of it or in it. Sacrifice and resurrection. The greatest reward that the self can ever gain requires the greatest sacrifice, and that sacrifice is the sacrifice of the self's alter ego. It is the self's alter ego, through which you are, at this very moment, experiencing life. In other words, it is through the image that you have of yourself that your focus of attention is directed. You think you are in this physical, material world, because your physical senses give you that impression. Your physical senses tell you that the world is real, and it is, but when you are in deep thought or when dreaming, you sense another reality, one that is not sensed by the physical senses, and that reality seems just as real because it is. How do we determine what is real? How do we know what really exists and has substance and form? If something is real, then it can be affected and cause an effect. Everything that we can sense must be real, whether in the world or in the mind. We know things are real because we have received information confirming their existence. Wherever we focus our attention, we receive an echo back from them. We are aware only of what is real. It is to the self that all information is directed, regardless of the path it has taken, and the last place that the information travels through on its way to the self, is the self's alter ego. This is the reception of knowledge. The transmission of energy from the self goes the other way through the alter ego, controlling either the mind or the physical body. The alter ego is not the self, it is an image of what the self believes itself to be. My pre-transcendence and enlightenment. It is now coming to the end of 2019. My transcendence and enlightenment happened about 15 years ago, and I have spent a lot of time thinking about what happened and its cause. Why me? I wasn't searching for enlightenment, I didn't even know what it was. I hadn't studied or followed any religion. I was just a guy raised by a single parent who has always lived in rented social housing. I left school with no qualifications and never went to college or university. Just an ordinary guy born into poverty and struggling through life, and wondering what it was all about. For most of my life I was very shy and suffered from low self-esteem. My spirit had been broken at a very young age, and all I ever really wanted was to be accepted and loved. I knew not long after coming into this world that I had entered a game that I was not good at. It required people to be deceitful and not care about hurting the competition. After 30 years of struggling to hold my marriage together and raising 4 children and 4 grandchildren that were not my own, I finally gave up trying. You can't make people love you no matter what you do. I had to face reality for the first time, and it was very difficult. I felt so alone and the future looked very dark and empty. I had always put others first and this had been my reward. I have always been tenacious, not wanting to give in, but now I had no choice. Another thing about me was that when the chips were down or when someone close was being lied about and wrongly hurt, I would become very protective, not caring what would happen to me for doing so. I would put my life on the line. Well, there I was, having faced a terrible reality, with nothing left to lose that I cared about. There was nowhere that my attention wanted to go, except on myself and my predicament. Why had it come to this? Now I had to face the reality of who I was, and what was wrong with me that I had ended up like this. I had to look at myself with total honesty. I had to face myself, whatever was revealed, good or bad, and accept the judgment of the truth I had tried to live by. It is not so difficult when you have nothing left to lose. I had done things in my life that I regretted and was sorry for. I had also done things that I felt was good and right, and I accepted and owned all of them. I also remembered what people had done to me, so much hurt, deception, lies, and used for their own benefit, but as always I felt no hate, no desire for revenge. If my mother had said to me when I was born, "Welcome to hell," at least I would have been warned. I thought that if I had played the game, one would have been good at it, and people would have respected and loved me. Did I waste my life being sensitive, compassionate, loving, and forgiving? Was this a mental disorder that prevented me from competing in the game of life? Was my suffering, downfall, and loss my own fault? I was quite intelligent and could put my hand to many things. Friends would say to me that they couldn't understand me, that with what I know and can do I should be driving around in a nice car, have my own house, a lovely family with kids of my own, and plenty of money in the bank. The problem was that I cared more about people than money and material things. So I began questioning love, and I realized that without love nothing has any worth, not even truth or life itself, and without empathy, love cannot be shared with another. It would leave the self alone, surrounded with an unbridgeable gap. A life without love that is good and right is a wasted life, and all that is left behind are material things and memories that fade to dust, unless you have achieved fame. I questioned love from many angles, even asking how it could be justified after it had caused me so much suffering. I came to the understanding that it wasn't love that had caused me hurt, it was my disappointment at the lack of its return, and the fact that it left me open to being made a fool of and being used. I realized that my suffering was my own fault, because my love had been conditional, I had expected a reward. I was told many times that I was soft-hearted and easily led, but even this didn't matter to me. Love was in my nature and I couldn't change that, it seemed as if I was doomed. I could see that there was a struggle going on in the world, and that it could either end up with everyone loving and caring for each other, or love would be seen as an obstacle to success and enjoyment, and everyone would care only for themselves. Imagine that for a moment, a world of love and peace, or a world in total conflict, leading to hell on earth. Love was in my nature, and I saw it as the right way to be. I would be true to myself whatever came, and accept love in its fullness without the need for reward. I would make my love whole and unconditional. Another thing about myself is that I have always been logical and I have always questioned everything, always searching for the truth with an open mind, without the desire for answers to be a certain way. That is what led me away from religion, so that at the transcendence point I had become an atheist. I had faced the prospect of death, and the logical conclusion was that if there was no life after death, then I would not know that in the absence of awareness. If there was life after death, then the adventure would continue. I have to say that after the life I had lived, my hope was that there was no life after death. It is because of this that I was left with no fear of dying. The illusion shatters. I didn't realize what was happening to me back then, or that I was approaching spiritual suicide, not of myself but of my alter ego. I didn't even realize that I had an alter ego, and that I was experiencing life through it. I had always felt somehow separate from my physical body. My instincts told me that I was not of the same substance as the world, I was not made of atoms. It is in the feeling and recognizing the difference that the self awakens, and begins questioning the nature of its reality and the reason for its existence. I had spent a lifetime searching for those answers and I hadn't found them. I began considering all the effort that I had put into living and surviving in this world, and I weighed up the joy and suffering I had experienced, and thought it would have been a blessing not to have been born. Life itself felt like a futile endeavor. The only thing that gave my life value was the good things I had done to make others happy, even though a lot of those things required a sacrifice of my own pleasure. That was the only reason I had to continue my existence. I would now continue my life not for my own benefit but for the benefit of others. My love would be unconditional and expressed without the need for reward. At least I would have added some pleasure and comfort to those who were suffering as I had. I wanted nothing from the world for myself, not even pleasure. I would not be the way that the world tried to teach me to be. This was my life and mine alone. I would be true to myself and I alone would live it according to my will, and I would extend that right to everyone else. I would never try to control them in any way. I had forgiven everyone every hurt they ever caused me, and a great feeling of peace came over me. I had realized that everyone was struggling, we all came into the world the same. Who was I to judge anyone? All I could give was love and understanding. I would now never look up to anyone or down to them. We always were and are equal. I had stepped out of the game, my desire for pleasure had ended and my life was of no worth to me. I am that I am flashed through my mind, and suddenly the illusion of who and what the world had led me to believe I was shattered, and I found myself in another place full of light. I found my true self. I had found my true beginning and my true uncorrupted image. I had returned to innocence, in the light of understanding and perfect love. I have returned with my perfect and true alter ego, and I have realized that life is a truly amazing experience. All I have accomplished, you can do also. This has been the life of I. No one ever ceases to exist, you will live forever, let it be with unconditional love, truth and the light of understanding. It is your destiny, a life eternal and unbroken. Not of the world, that which is of the world is a part of the universe, which is governed by immutable laws. Therefore nothing that is of the world can pick or choose its actions or reactions. Your physical body is a part of the world, as are the physical bodies of all sentient beings. If you were no more than a physical body, you would have no choice in your actions or reactions. In other words, you would have no control over what you do, you would not be responsible for any of your actions or reactions, because without the ability to choose you would not have free will. It is your ability to choose your actions and reactions that prove you are not of this world, and therefore you are not the physical body that you have been led to believe you are. The ability to choose is not an illusion, it is a reality. It is an ability that is not possessed by any entity in the material realm, not even the material universe as a whole. The ability to choose is only found in the spiritual realm, and is only possessed by spiritual sentient beings, such as yourself. Nothing that is of the material realm is sentient, it does not possess awareness, desire or free will, but the self does, and so it can change what would have been in the material realm by adding an effect according to its own desire. It does this by controlling the actions of the physical body that it animates. An apple falls from a tree, if the self does not interfere the apple hits the ground, but if the self chooses to catch the apple it has changed what would have been, in other words the self has interfered with and taken control of the normal flow of events in the material realm. If you were of this world you would be controlled by it, and you would have no control over the destiny of anything in it. Everything that is in the material realm is in a constant state of change. Everything that is in the mind is in a constant state of change, but that which is aware of these things, the self that is referred to as I, the I in I am, is not and cannot be changed. Everything but the self is dissolving, and when it does, there will only be the self and the mind left. You are not of the world because the mind exists between you and world. These things will pass away, but the self and the truth will not pass away. My love, blessings and peace be with you.